dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream. Masters often compelled to sell this class of slaves out of deference to the feelings and cruel as the deed may strike anyone to be. For a man to sell his own children, 29. Then God smiled and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. God said, "This is the legend of Cassius Clay, the most beautiful fighter in the world today. He talks a great deal and brags indeed of a muscular punch that's incredible and speedy. We'll get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord."
Well, good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is JDew coming to you from Greenville, South Carolina, where we are going to be remembering Willie Earle this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Over the course of this experience, what we're going to do is talk about the history of these tragic events in Greenville, South Carolina, and in Pickens County, South Carolina, that happened back in 1947. We will also be able to screen the film, the new documentary piece that was put together by these great academics and production team over the course of the last several years, and we'll talk to them about that. And then we will come back and we'll have a discussion about some of the themes or anything else that you'd like to know. 74 years ago this week, they stole him out of jail and killed him in Greenville County, South Carolina. Tonight, we will talk about this man, Willie Earle, his friends who were left behind, and a new documentary film project that brings back what Greenville has tried to forget. We invite you tonight to listen in until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Yeah, that's right.
When you were growing up, did you behave well? You wouldn't get lynched?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 The ones. Be careful. Don't mess around because they'll lynch their kids. And they would.
In the South, when blacks were caught breaking the law, they were hung from a tree. It would be a ceremony, an event where people would come in to witness this. What they would do, they would blindfold the black. They would put their hands behind his back. They would put a noose around their neck, and they would be left hanging. Willie Earle was not hung from a tree, but it was a lynching because of the way that he was killed.
I believe if we're living today and knowing him from back then at that time of age, I think we would be some.
That's good.
Very good.
He'd be a fit man.
That's good.
Upright man.
Morning time. I'll be off for 6 weeks, and then I'll take 3 weeks later, 3 weeks. So,
Oh, good.
yeah, I get a whole year to take it. So I get a total of 12 weeks, which is nice.
That is nice.
Yeah, especially in the U.S.
Yeah. My actually.
All right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you would please try to keep your mic muted. We are going to experience a conversation here with the filmmakers, and we're so glad to have them tonight. But if you're not in that group, there's always someone, isn't there? And that's how 2020 reminds us that it was out there one day. It sneaks up on us in 2021. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce a few folks that have joined us tonight for a conversation. In the first session of our experience tonight, we're going to meet the filmmakers behind this project, and we're going to talk about the historical significance of what has happened in Greenville County and in Pickens County. And we'll also talk about their experience in putting that story together for us. So I'd like to welcome a few of those folks from the producing team right now. We have 5 of them. Allow me to introduce them. We have first the executive director behind the project, John Wertheimer, professor of history at Davidson College. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having us on tonight.
Yes, sir. We've got the co-director of the project, Thomas Espy, filmmaker and digital media specialist at Davidson College.
Thank you. I second John. Thanks for
Yes,
having us.
sir. Wonderful. I'm glad to have you guys. Thank you so much for providing this. Cassie Harding, co-director, currently serving as a paralegal in federal public defense and a research consultant for management consulting firm that is down in Atlanta, lives in the metro area. Cassie, thank you for being here.
Hello, thank you. Happy to be in the community.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Mr. Frank Carroll, co-director, associate producer at WETA, a PBS station in Washington, D.C.
Yes, thank you for having us. It's my pleasure.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking the time. And Stevie Jeffries, co-director, a buying coordinator at Tuckernuck in Washington, D.C.
Hello, thank you so much for having us tonight.
We are blessed to have you and to have you all. Thank you guys so much. So let's get right into it, shall we? So when you're thinking about the historical perspective and significance of what happened, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Willie Earle, a 24-year-old black man, was arrested in one county over from Greenville County, Pickens County, in 1947, and he was accused of assaulting a white cab driver and then put in jail in Pickens County. And February the 16th, the next day, he was taken from jail by a mob of over 30 white men, most of them cab drivers, and he was brought just across the county line into Greenville, South Carolina, Greenville County, where I live, and he was lynched. After that, Greenville County, a few months later in May, held the largest lynching trial in the history of the United States of America. And dare I say, it won't ever be a record that Greenville is able to shake. At least we hope not. So in May of that year, eventually, all folks, including 26 who admitted to being part of the mob with FBI confessions, were all acquitted of any charges, including murder, after about a deliberation from an all-white jury of about 5.5 hours. So now we're here 74 years later, plus one day, talking about this experience and some of the people Mr. Willie Earle left behind and what Greenville has left us to make sense of, or never make sense of, and try to make peace with, or never make peace with, in this tragic, tragic event. So first, I'd like to jump in, if I may, with you, John. John, would you please tell us how you came into this project, what your role is historically, and kind of how maybe this turned from an academic or interest exercise for you and your team into the documentary film that it is today.
Thanks, JDew. I'm a legal historian of the South, and I'm also a teacher. And you put those things together in the way I do it. I like to teach my students by having them do things with me and get the experience of doing research themselves and having history come alive for them the way it does for me when I go into the archives and find stories in there about previous eras where the people are completely different and yet they're also very much the same as we are today. So several years before I met this group of students who you see on the screen, I worked with a seminar of my legal history students on a very little known, obscure part of South Carolina's legal history that was an unusual and unexpected and still surprising part of the history of white supremacy and Jim Crow. This goes back to the 1890s and the creation of the Jim Crow white supremacist system that was led into the state constitution by the dominant figure in South Carolina politics at that time, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who tried to did disfranchise African Americans overwhelmingly and establish a white supremacist order. But at the same time, he included in the same constitution an anti-lynching provision that would allow family members of lynch victims to sue the counties in which the lynchings occurred and recover a minimum of $2,000, which in 1895 was big money, a minimum of $2,000 from the county, whether or not any officials were involved in the lynching. So even if just a lynch mob acting without any sheriffs or any jailers or anything killed a lynch victim in a county, that county could be forced to pay $2,000 to the family. And this was really interesting because it helps us rethink the relationship between white supremacy and lynching. For white supremacists, lynching, for at least the leaders, the elite white supremacists, lynching was an embarrassment. It called unwanted attention from the North, from liberals, from African-American activists who wanted to delegitimate white supremacy. And they wanted to show that it was that white supremacist governance was good governance, et cetera. So this is a little told story. And the way we wanted to tell it was through a specific case, which was Tessie Earle versus Greenville County. Tessie Earle was the mother of Willie Earle, the lynch victim here. And following his killing and following the mass acquittal that you described, JDew, of his confessed lynchers, she was able to sue Greenville County and recover some money. And this is a little known story that gives more agency to African Americans in the legal system. She was a Black woman and she had legal representation from the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall and all this sort of stuff. It's a little known story. So that was the story that my students and I researched years ago. And then I got involved with Thomas, whom you'll hear from in a minute, who's a filmmaker, and we decided that we were going to make a film, a documentary film, to bringing together the medium of film, which is has a great power emotionally, and it's easy to spread to lots of people more widely than, say, academic scholarship. And we're going to wed that to historical research, and tell stories in this different way. And we decided that we were going to tell the story of the Willie Earle lynching because it's an important story politically. It still resonates with our culture. Our students are interested in it. It's still important politically. And we had a lot of good information about it from a history research standpoint, including a lot of gripping photographs and things like that. So we brought these two things together, the legal history research that I had done, and then Thomas's expertise as a filmmaker. And the students that you see on the screen, Cassie and Stevie and Frank, were part of the first group of students that I tried to teach along with Thomas into the art of documentary filmmaking. We told the story of Willie Earle, and we learned more about it than I had known even after studying it pretty much in depth previously. That's the origin of our involvement with the story.
Now, with all of the important court cases that kind of triggered and changed history and potentially moved the needle forward or backward when it came to race relations in our country, the fact that you said that the Earle case is a little known story, what made you kind of find it? And what was the reason that you decided to pick this one as opposed to some of the other stories that maybe some of us have even heard, whether it was Brown versus Board of Education or Plessy Ferguson? What about Greenville? What about Earle? What about what was going on here kind of caught your attention, and how'd you even find it?
Great question. I'm, as I said, a legal historian, but also a teacher. And my being a teacher and wanting to get my students into the archives turned me into a Southern legal historian and ultimately a historian of law in South Carolina. Davidson's in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, near Charlotte. It's a straight shot down 77 to get to the state archives in the area of Columbia. So after my initial foray into this, which is in North Carolina, where I live, I published a book based on the stories that my students and I had excavated, had explored, had told out of North Carolina's legal history in the context of my seminar. Then as a follow-up to that book, I moved that a whole operation into South Carolina, and I'm currently in the process. July 1st is the deadline for submitting final version of a manuscript that's all about race and the law in South Carolina. Everybody knows about Brown versus Board of Education and Plessy versus Ferguson and cases like that are federal cases. They're from the United States Supreme Court. In these books that I've been working on about the Carolinas and their legal history, I look only at state cases. State law outnumbers federal law 100 to 1, and it has more to do with people's lives day to day for the most part. So telling those stories from the perspective of state law is very exciting to me because it's little known, and I want my students to get that excitement, the thrill of discovery of things that people don't generally know. In this South Carolina book, which is all about race and the law, because that's what my students are interested in. They really set the agenda. That's what they wanted to study. We have 2 chapters on slavery, the era of slavery, 1 chapter on, which is kind of the pivot on the Reconstruction era following the Civil War, and then 3 chapters on the Jim Crow era. 1 on school segregation from Dillon County, South Carolina, 1 on the jury system, the all-white jury that was from the area around Columbia, the state capital, and then this one, which is about lynching. So it fits very well to help us look in different ways at the whole Jim Crow system, the way that law in some cases created, in many cases reinforced, and in some cases weakened or overturned the white supremacist system, that the rule of law has an interesting interaction with the Jim Crow order. This is a good example of that because the law, the anti-lynching law that I just described, allowing family members to sue the counties where the lynchings occurred and recover damages, was designed to suppress lynching because everybody knew that if a lynching occurred in your county, your taxes were going to go up because a family would recover money and everybody would have to pay more taxes to pay that family member. That was the theory behind the law. Prior to that, in the early period, lynchings were devastatingly common. They would decline in South Carolina as elsewhere over the years to the point that by 1947 with Willie Earle, they were so unusual that it was a huge deal. There were reporters from all around the country and in fact around the world who were fascinated by the Willie Earle case, in part because by then in 1947, they were not very common. And after World War II, this was really an embarrassment, not just a national embarrassment for the South, it was an international embarrassment for the United States in the context of the early Cold War. That was part of the story. The law that I described enabled Black families to go to court and to recover damages in a way that enabled them to demonstrate not only that they had been wrong, they had suffered a wrong for which there had to be a legal remedy, but it was a public wrong. It wasn't just suing the individual people involved. It was suing the whole county. Everybody was implicated. That's one of the roles that the law could play. And yet, we argue in the book, in a weird way, it was designed to reinforce white supremacy by suppressing lynching, which was considered to be an embarrassment to the white supremacist order that could, if it was embarrassing enough and powerful enough politically, it could get the federal government to impose a national anti-lynching law, which the South did not want. The white South wanted to control race relations themselves. They wanted to suppress lynching to keep the North out. That was some of the rhetoric. What's interesting about the Willie Earle case and the way that the politics had changed by the time World War II came around is that even white supremacist leaders in South Carolina, including Strom Thurmond himself, who had just been elected to the governorship, they were on board with bringing the FBI in to try to round up the lynchers and show that South Carolina was not a bunch of yahoos, but was a place where the rule of order applied. It was an embarrassment, and the local sheriffs and the county sheriffs, the local police, and Strom Thurmond, everybody scene from the power structure, the segregationist, white supremacist power structure, was on board with bringing in the FBI and rounding up the lynchers. So there's all kinds of complicated, nuanced things going out. And I think it's a really rich story. We don't get into all of that in our 17-minute documentary, but you can read the book if you want to learn more about it.
Yes, sir. Well, I appreciate that. You know, there's many things that I want to unpack and uncover from what you said there, but I don't want to go too fast, and we do have some other folks to introduce. But it is interesting to me that you say this is how the law was set up and why, because it's very interesting that I believe most folks who are from the upstate community who live in a wonderful place of Greenville, South Carolina, that is in the top 10 of so many different statistics when it comes to beauty, when it comes to downtown walkability, family friendliness, affordability, are actually very, very unaware of the events that we're talking about tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn to chime in, if you would, while we watch this next piece that reveals how the city in the last few years has dealt with the Willie Earle case, downtown Greenville. If you would, please let us know where you are zooming in from tonight. So if you would, jump into the chat and let us know where you're zooming in from, what your interest is in here, why you showed up tonight. Would love to know that. And before we bring on the filmmaker who helped pilot this project alongside John, we're going to watch our next video. And it's just myself, downtown Greenville, on the Main Street area, talking through the historical marker that just was placed just a few years ago to commemorate the terrible situation of Willie Earle's lynching and the trial downtown.
This Beaux Arts building, built in 1916 to 1918, was the fourth Greenville County courthouse from 1918 to 1950. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1994. The largest lynching trial in U.S. history was held here May 12th through the 21st, 1947. Willie Earle, a young black man accused of assaulting white cab driver Thomas W. Brown, had been lynched by a white mob on Bramlett Road in Greenville. The trial of 31 whites, 28 of them cab drivers, was rare at the time and drew national attention. Though 26 defendants admitted being part of the mob, all defendants were acquitted by an all-white jury. Rebecca West's opera in Greenville, published in the New Yorker on June 14, 1947, interpreted the trial and its aftermath. Widespread outrage over the lynching and the verdict spurred new federal civil rights policies.
Now, at this time, ladies and gentlemen, I will introduce the other half of the executive filmmaking team. And John may have a few things to say about this young man as well, but when I saw what they were doing, I had to be a part of it. I had to help them tell their story in this community. As you heard from John, none of the folks who actually have worked on this, and several of you are Greenvillians, you live in the upstate. The folks who are bringing us this project today, thank you so much. They're not from here. They are from other places, live in other places, do work in other places, North Carolina and beyond. I'd like to introduce you now to Thomas Espy. He's the co-director, filmmaker, digital media specialist at Davidson College, who was brought on by John to kind of spearhead this project and many other documentary projects that I believe they do together. And at this time, I'd love to hear from him. Thomas, you got me out there loud and clear?
Yep, thanks, JDew. Appreciate that. So yeah, I was coming into being a part of this class. I was a MFA student at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, and I lived in North Carolina since 2013. I've worked in higher education and decided to make a change in my career towards something I've loved my entire life, and that's the art of filmmaking. I also worked at the School of the Arts in higher education prior to getting an MFA in filmmaking. So I'm originally from Cleveland, near Cleveland, Ohio. So that's a little background about me. So up until this project, I had only worked on projects that were more observational, current day type films, short films, and one feature film. And these all followed characters or participants in these films that I had developed pretty close relationship with prior to actually turning the camera on and telling a modern day story. And a lot of it had to do with art and mental illness type issues. So whenever this opportunity came up and I met with John and we talked about making a historical documentary, that was a challenge to me because I definitely have never made a historical documentary. Although I am a fan of how stories can be told, historical stories can be told through film. So throughout the class, we were producing student-made film, and students made parts of the film. Altogether, it was about an hour long, and each segment was made by a student. So it wasn't connected stylistically, but the story was there. And the story contained pretty much everything John mentioned. Of course, it would be 4-day, 5 or 6 day long film if all the details were there. But I mean, it had pretty much every player and every character as a part of the film. And it was a really great student film, and it was a really great segments by each student. But we wanted to be able to put this in festivals and get the story out, because as we worked with it throughout the semester, we became we felt like this needed to be heard. This is a story like we learned for the first time, at least myself. I had never learned about Willie Earle, partly because I'm from Ohio, but also partly because it is something that isn't talked about nearly enough. And then going into the summer, Stevie, Frank, and Cassie all they all signed up to be a part of this, to continue to work on the film throughout the summer. So really, all of the groundwork was done by the class, and the film, the directing and the editing of the film was done by them, and I was there to kind of help and guide. But I really fell in love with this film because again, like, I have to really fall in love with the film to really want to tell the story. When we met Willie Earle, or when we met Aquilus Jackson, who goes by AQ, who's in the film, and it's a modern day story about his memory of his friend from childhood, Willie Earle. And getting to know him and going back and interviewing him and getting to know him and his wife, we knew that we had to get his story out there, and that's kind of what it became. So I'll let the other three really like talk about that from their points of view as well, but that's kind of how it became the 17-minute short film that it is today.
Very good. So yes, at this time, I'd like to bring on the student team and everybody else who is our special guests and VIPs for tonight to come on and give us your perspective of what you learned, why you were interested in this project, and of course, maybe a little bit about your background or what you're doing now. So Stevie, why don't we start with you? I can see you in my view. So tell us about what brought you and attracted you to this group and to this project.
Yeah, so this was my junior year of college when the seminar took place in the springtime. And I had a little bit of background with filmmaking, but it was only ever for digital art projects. And so I felt like a little comfortable trekking into this seminar that was titled Filming Southern Legal History. And I think Dr. Wertheimer caught on pretty quickly that I did have a little bit of film background, very minimal skills looking back at it now, but that's what kind of spurred me to apply for a research grant through Davidson. And slowly our summer team started to form, Frank, Cassie, and I, and it was quite the adventure, spending 3 months traveling many, many miles in the car to and from Davidson, North Carolina to Greenville, and getting to meet so many incredible Greenville residents. And we really got to hear the story from many different perspectives about the larger history of Greenville and lynching and the Jim Crow era there from people who lived it, and also got to hear AQ's story, which was the most powerful of all. And I don't want to share too much because I want Frank and Cassie to have a chance too, but it was a very special opportunity, and it's something that I still hold very close to my heart, even 2 years into the real world.
Very good. Well, thank you for being here. We'll move on to the other ones after one question. So Stevie, which roles did you kind of have within the film project that we see, or outside of the documentary we'll see tonight? So help us understand some of what you had your fingers in.
Yeah, so I would say it was definitely a team effort. It was a very collaborative effort. Cassie Frank, Thomas, and I all like going to every single shoot in Greenville. So all of the footage that you'll see in the film tonight, we were all pretty much there filming AQ together on multiple different occasions. I would say that I would like to be called like the logistics manager of our team. Frank was on the phone constantly finding people's numbers in Greenville to try to get their stories. And I was definitely behind the wheel of the car, making sure we get to Greenville safely. So it was it was definitely a team effort. So.
Very good. All right. Now, of course, there's no small parts, just small actors, right? So everybody has a big part. So Frank, we'll move over to you. I can see you over there. Frank, tell us more about yourself. Tell us about the logistics, whatever you want to tell us, and help us understand kind of what brought you into the project.
Well, luckily for everyone, I was not involved in logistics. But I'm currently an associate producer at WETA, which is a PBS station in the capital in Washington, D.C., which is a position that I came to in large part because I found working on this project to be so tremendously rewarding. And I really enjoyed the process of making a film, but also like I just found that I wanted to do something for a living that allowed me to ask people questions, that allowed me to interview people and to really get to hear people's stories, because I found doing that and telling those stories through film, but really just also getting to put a camera on people to be one of the most rewarding things that I had done up to that point. So yeah, that's kind of where I am now in terms of working on this project. I felt like there were the kind of two parts. There was the class part, and I think the documentary that we came up with there was very informative and was very was interesting in terms of like the scope of South Carolina history. But I feel like for me, when I look back on making this film, the thing that sticks out to me was this moment of working with a gentleman by the name of Will Gravely, who's a professor or retired professor of religion, and who has written a book on this, which was absolutely instrumental. We interviewed him a couple times, although it didn't make it into the final film. And he's still a good friend of ours. I think it was him who'd passed on the name. He said, I spoke to a man named AQ Jackson. Maybe you'd want to speak to him. He's an older man, but he's very, very sharp, and he has a close connection to this case. And so I got a number, I think, from Yellow Pages, and then cold called him. And his wife, Johnny Mae, picked up the phone and handed it off to Aquilus, and he was so unbelievably gracious and really did want to kind of share this experience. He, as you'll see in the film, was a close childhood friend of Willie Earle, and has lived in this area his whole life. I mean, he lives on a street, literally Aquilus Lane. And so I think getting to meet him, that was kind of like maybe midway through the summer. That was like a really pivotal event, I think, for the film, and getting to go out to his house and spend some time with him and his wife. And we went back a couple times, and many phone calls. That was, I think, what really made both the film and also left the imprint on me as someone who was working on the project. And I think left an imprint on all of us as being this really incredible opportunity to hear somebody who's really lived this and who is just such a capable storyteller who's so willing to share, but he's also like a tremendously captivating person. And I think that was something that we were just so unbelievably fortunate in. And it really was in some ways a stroke of luck, but that meeting him and that really kind of changed the direction. So yeah, I'd say that was kind of looking back. I think that made the film what it is, and I'm really thankful for that. So
very good. So one question for you, Frank, before we move on. So tell me about what surprised you about the people that you bumped into, like AQ, like his wife. What was, you seem to be potentially kind of excited and surprised about some of the folks that you were able to learn and meet and befriend. And I think one of the things that comes to folks' minds about the Jim Crow era, prior to maybe the acts and civil rights laws and bills that happened locally or nationally around the time of the things that we're talking about. What kind of surprised you there? Maybe it wasn't ancient history and it was kind of your first encounter with someone who had gone through this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was in part, I'm from Rhode Island. I'm a proud Rhode Islander, although I'm in DC now. And I think coming to the Jim Crow South, one of the things that you realize is the extent to which this is living memory. This is not some, like, you read about it in textbooks. I had a big interest in history from middle school, high school onwards. And so these are the things, you kind of know the facts about the laws that were discriminatory and the way in which Southern society was so segregated. But when you come and you encounter people who have, I feel like, lived through it doesn't really do it justice, because it felt like so much more dignified than just enduring it. But it was this kind of thing that was a reality for AQ and his wife, and like hadn't stopped them from living. And I think it's kind of a combination of being unfamiliar with like the real presence of people whose stories it lives on, and rather than just kind of historical documents or those kind of things. I also think it's one of the things about the South that as a Northerner, I didn't really appreciate, which is the extent of like, people are so deeply familiar with their history. And it was like, when you talk to AQ, you weren't only getting his story, you're also getting the story of his great-great-grandfather who was given the land after being freed after the Civil War. And you were talking like this kind of network of people that I think is one of the great rich things about doing Southern history. So I think that surprised me. It's just the extent to which it feels like you go down south and everybody's a historian, which is a great thing, but it's can also be a very daunting thing. And I think I was fortunate to work with the people. I think to do it in a group and to kind of encounter these things together helped, but that was definitely a surprising aspect of it for me.
Appreciate you, Frank. Thank you so much. Cassie, we'll move on to you as another student perspective. You're now working in federal public defense, but a couple years ago, you got involved with this project, and we'd love to hear from you.
Okay. I think I kind of fell into this project, getting into the course initially. I was a sophomore, so I was the youngest out of the group. And Dr. Wertheimer kind of reached out to me, I think, early on before the semester started, and asked if I wanted to join. And like my classmates, I was intrigued. The name of the course is very interesting. I wasn't sure what I was getting into, but I was like, I know Dr. Wertheimer, and this is going to be interesting. So joining the course and having 12 other voices surrounding that seminar table and us discussing the case and how we're diving into it, and eventually making this very choppy but interesting student film at the end, I realized from there on, I knew I wasn't just going to be a historian or aspire to be a historian, but there's a public effect that you could have. And so seeing during the summer what Stevie, Frank, and I could do, like driving in the car, going to archives, meeting people, and all connecting it together and editing this film with Thomas, I knew there was a greater influence that we could have. And I'm happy to have gone through this experience with them. And as we're talking about AQ, seeing him on camera was perfect. It was like honestly a very cathartic experience for him. And I'm happy that we could give that to him, because he had never really talked about the story until we kind of bumped into and talked to him about it. And you will see very raw human emotion on the screen. And we read a lot of documents, we went to a lot of archives, a lot of dusty papers with the white gloves, but I think the human aspect of the film is what gets me, because it's not only effective in telling you the story, but it's also affective, and it draws you in. It truly, you can't stop watching. Mm-hmm. And I love this film dearly, and I'm always happy to talk about it with anyone. And I can't believe it's been years now that we've been working on this film constantly together. And we even had an opportunity that summer to visit the Equal Justice Initiative and the memorial and the museum down in Montgomery, Alabama. And we were trying to work with their officials about getting like how would you call it? Some like dirt to represent the lynching of Willie Earle in Greenville County. And we're still working on that. That's still something in process that could happen. But just seeing how this story is intertwined in greater stories out there, like this is not just one isolated case. There's so many cases out there that need to be recognized. And most people don't know about a lot of the lynching cases that happen because they got lost in the dark. You know, things just happen in the dark that don't come to light. And I'm thankful that we are able to use this film to bring something to light, to bring attention to it. Because we also did on the street interviews with people who live in Greenville one afternoon. And you'd be surprised how many people had never seen those, like the statue or like the signs with the words on them, or talking about the case around the courthouse. How many people don't know about that? Or in their history classes when they were growing up, never heard about Willie Earle. So if we can be storytellers that are also informative and drive people to learn more about their local history, then I'm happy to make more films like this.
Wonderful.